When you look around the world, you see a stark contrast. The Islamic world is plagued with conflict, terrorism, discrimination, and war. Whereas Western countries lack the same level of chaos and are far superior in terms of prosperity, equality, security, and overall quality of life. The Western world is so much better that millions of Muslims flee Islamic countries to come live in the West. On the surface, it shows us Islam creates more inferior civilizations than what we have produced in the West, which drew heavily from Christianity. However, when we talk about this stark contrast, we are met with resistance and told this cannot be Islam's fault. Other factors are what caused the chaos and terrorism in the Islamic world. But this is simply not true. No one is denying other variables are at play, but research has demonstrated Islam is a cause of many of its problems. And if more countries were to become Islamic, we can expect that they will suffer from a host of problems that we currently see throughout the Islamic world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Islam is responsible for so much of the chaos around the world, and why we must do everything we can to keep it from spreading. If you look at the Global Terrorism Index of 2024, the deadliest terrorist groups are all Islamic. Islamic groups also commit the most acts of terror and kill more people as compared to non-Islamist terrorist groups. And when we look at these groups, they constantly cite Islamic passages from the Quran and Sunnah as motivations for their terrorism. But Muslim apologists living in the West push back and say they have misinterpreted the Quran and do not represent Islam. Real Islam would never lead to so much conflict and violence, but a ton of research challenges this narrative. Davis Brown has spent several years studying this topic. He has conducted many studies, like this one, that covered the influence of religion on interstate armed conflict, using data from 1946 to 2002, and utilized robustness checks for accuracy. He looked at the influence of three religions: Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. In terms of government religious preference, his model found that Buddhism was non-significant, meaning it's not associated with more or less conflict. Christianity was strongly negatively associated with war and conflict, but Islam was positively associated with it. To quote, "A state with a non-zero median Christian GRP is 60% less likely to initiate a fatal armed conflict than a state with no Christian GRP. A state with a maximum Christian GRP is 73% less likely. Whereas empirical results suggest that states with Christian GRPs are less likely to use force, they also suggest that states with Muslim GRPs are moderately more likely. At the lowest threshold of using force, a state with the median non-zero Muslim GRP is 84% more likely to resort to force than a state with no Muslim GRP. In other words, societies that have an Islamic government preference are more likely to create conflict and use force, whereas other types of societies will resort to conflict less often." And he strengthened his results in a book he published in 2019. In contrast to the Christian war ethic, which is demonstrated to be restrictive, the war ethic of Islam overall appears to be permissive, i.e., states with Muslim regime preferences overall initiate interstate conflicts at a higher rate than states without such regime preferences. This correlation is shown to hold even when dyads involving Israel are removed from the model. This is not merely his opinion. These are the results of his models, which found the same results for Sunni and Shia Islam, even after factoring other variables that could account for a spurious correlation. So when a society is Muslim, they will adopt an Islamic government, and we can expect conflicts to increase. Whereas when a society adopts Christianity, this contributes to conflicts decreasing. Monica Duffy Toft's model found similar results. The deadliest religious civil wars involve Muslim combatants. Civil wars with religion as central and involving Muslims result in an average of 180,000 total deaths, 3 times more than any other type of civil war, including Muslims or not. She also controlled for other variables, stating, "These models provide support for Hypothesis 1b. Centrally religious civil wars are disproportionately an Arab-Muslim phenomenon, even when controlling for standard variables and potential confounders. The results are clear that religion is a motivator for rebellion among Arab Muslims, while their Christian counterparts are more likely to be motivated along secular lines after 1990. Thus, she found that Islam leads to more religious civil wars among Arab Muslims, but this feature was lacking among Christians. In one study, Jonathan Fox found that Islamic civilization is the most prone to conflict. And in another he found, religious legitimacy is about 50% more important for conflicts involving Islamic majorities than for conflicts involving non-Islamic majorities, including those involving Christian majorities. Islamic conflicts score about twice as high on both the composite religion variable and on the relevance of religion variable as non-Islamic groups, and about 2.5 times as high as Christian majorities. Thus, there is clear evidence that religion is considerably more important to conflicts involving Islamic majorities and less important in conflicts involving Christian majorities. M. Stephen Fish found that there is far more political violence in Muslim countries. In fact, it is more than double what is found in Christian ones. His model led him to concluding that the Muslim effect is too small to be significant, but he still had to conclude, all we can say with certainty is that Islamists do bear some responsibility for major episodes of political violence in the post-war world, but non-Islamist actors, including the revolutionary movement and government in China and partisans of ethnic strife in Middle and East Africa, have been responsible for roughly as much carnage as Islamists have. When it comes to terrorism, though, he did find that Islamists have been disproportionately responsible for terrorism. He says, self-proclaimed Islamists have been responsible for over 3/5 of all incidents and nearly 7/10 of all deaths. Terrorism is not a uniquely Muslim disease, but its perpetrators in recent times are disproportionately Islamists. Muslims may be prone to tolerate terrorism in the name of their religion, which in turn points our attention to explanations for Islamist terrorism that have a religious dimension. Choi and Brown also focused on terrorism and found that Islam is a strong and consistent predictor of suicide attacks and increased terrorism. The more Islam there is in a country, the more likely there will be an increase in suicide attacks. They also were able to focus on different groups within Islam, and their model found countries with greater Muslim populations are likely to experience more suicide attacks. Countries with greater Sunni Muslim populations are likely to encounter more suicide attacks, and countries with greater Hanafi Muslim populations, in contrast to other Sunni legal schools, face the greatest risk of experiencing suicide attacks. The overall analysis suggests that Islam is positively associated with suicide attacks. They also note that Salafism plays a role in this. We reason that high levels of suicide attacks in Hanafi or Shafi countries are related to the subversive aspect of the Salafi movement. Certain schools of thought in Islam are associated with more terrorism. Similarly, another paper found evidence that sectarian violence between Sunni Muslims and non-Sunni Muslims emerges as a substantive, significant, and positive predictor of suicide attacks. It is often pointed out that Muslims are the victims of terrorist attacks more than others. This is often true, but a lot of the motivations behind them come from sectarian infighting within Islam, which would explain why Muslims are often the victims. But also, we can see that non-Muslims do not fare much better in Islamic countries. Minority groups, like Jews and Christians, experience higher levels of discrimination and persecution than what they experience outside of the Islamic world. Muslim apologists often claim the people of the book, Jews and Christians, are protected under the Sharia, but the reality is more complex. Under Sharia, Jews and Christians are allowed to remain in their respective religions, but we are treated as second-class citizens and do not have equal rights. We are forbidden from evangelizing, public worship, building new churches, or repairing old ones. We are placed under dhimmi status and must pay a jizya tax to represent our submission to the Muslim authorities. Dhimmi men are forbidden from marrying Muslim women, but Muslim men can marry non-Muslim women. Our testimony carries less weight in court than the testimony from Muslims, and we are forbidden from riding horses, carrying weapons, and sometimes are forced to wear certain clothing to represent our submissive status. The Quran also says anyone who rejects the Quran is without reason. Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures, and do not take them as friends and allies. Because of all this, it's no wonder researchers have found rampant discrimination in the Islamic world. Fox's model found that Islamic majority groups engage in more than double the average level of religious discrimination as non-Islamic groups, and nearly 5 times the average level of Christian majority groups. Another study found that religious discrimination is much higher in Muslim-majority countries than in Christian-majority ones. Countries that utilize Sharia law are positively associated with social regulation of religion. Christianity was negatively associated with this, but positively associated with economic strength and democracy. Additionally, persecution of more than 1,000 persons is present in 40% of Muslim-majority countries, compared to 3.9% of Christian-majority countries. They conclude, as the percentage of Muslims increases, so does social regulation of religion, which increases the level of government regulation and therefore persecution. The same authors note in their book that a higher percentage of Muslims and the adoption of Sharia law is associated with higher social restrictions, whereas a higher percentage of Christians is associated with less social restrictions and more freedom. Furthermore, in countries where Muslims or religions other than Christianity are the majority, religious persecution is reported in 100% of the cases. Religious persecution is not only more prevalent among Muslim-majority countries, but it also generally occurs at more severe levels. 62% of Muslim-majority countries have a moderate to high level of persecution, compared with only 28% of Christian-majority countries and 60% of other countries. And also, another study found that in Muslim countries, apostates and people of the book experience about 4 times the rate of discrimination than Muslim minority groups do. People of the book, who are supposed to be protected according to the Quran and Islamic tradition, experience greater levels of discrimination than Orthodox Muslim minorities. In fact, heterodox groups like Ahmadis, Druze, or Baha'i experience the highest levels of persecution, most likely stemming from the fact that they accept prophetic individuals who came after Muhammad, and so the Quran and Sunnah do not recognize them like they recognize Jews and Christians. Research has also found a significant amount of authoritarianism within Muslim countries, as compared to Christian ones. Roland Salem looked at the effects of Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. He found that nations with higher Protestantism have more voice and accountability in government, citizen empowerment, political stability, non-governmental organizational membership, and have the ability to create political transformation. Catholicism is positively associated with citizen empowerment, higher levels of NGO membership, and political transformation. But Islam wasn't associated with any of these benefits. And he adds, lastly, the Islamic variable does not elicit statistical significance, but produces a negative coefficient congruent to the findings that Islamic states are beset with female disenfranchisement, which makes democratization unlikely. Midlarsky found in his paper that Islam is linked to autocracy in 2 out of 3 of his measures. M. Stephen Fish found that Islam is associated with more authoritarianism. He even says, "We controlled for the major structural factors that might create a spurious correlation between Islam and authoritarianism, and while several of these factors may explain part of the correlation, they do not account for all of it." The data cannot be more clear. Islam leads to more conflict, violence, discrimination, persecution, authoritarianism, less political stability, less citizen empowerment, and less voice and accountability. Muslims like Abdullah al-Andalusi have argued the world would be better if Muslims were in charge and acted as the world's police.
Islam has a brilliant method to grant the prayers of everyone around the world, Muslim and non-Muslim, who pray for peace, which is, I call it the Pax Islamica, from the Latin word pax, meaning peace, like the Pax Romanum, right? The peace of Rome. Because if you truly want peace around the world, then you need to take on the position of policeman, right? You need to then be the guardians of everyone.
However, the peer-reviewed data shows the opposite. We would see an increase in conflict, terrorism, violence, discrimination, persecution, and authoritarianism. These negative consequences cannot be entirely attributed to other factors. The studies I cited factor in other variables, like foreign occupation, armed groups, economic development, etc. Even after accounting for multiple variables, Islam was still found to be tied to these negative consequences. The world would not get better if we increased Islam's influence. It would get much worse. The question you might be asking is why? Why is it that Islam creates so many problems for humanity? It's because of many factors that are inherent in Islam. First, Islam lacks a robust concept of the separation of church and state, like what we find in the West. The separation of church and state emerged slowly out of the Christian tradition, and came from the idea that Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's." This fostered the idea that the spiritual and the worldly powers can be separate. The priest can focus on spiritual matters, and the officials in government can focus on earthly matters. A priest cannot use the state to force religious observance, and the state cannot use its power to force the clergy to do their bidding. Without the state working or coercing for a particular religion, this allows religious freedom, which has been associated with positive benefits, like better quality of life and economic prosperity. Also, when you have to figure out what to believe, rather than a government telling you what to believe, it increases your critical thinking skills, which leads to more intelligent individuals who go on to advance society in multiple ways. But when government and religion are tied together, the state often becomes the enforcer of religious dogma. Islam lacks a distinction between church and state. It's inherently a political religion, where the state is required to force Sharia. You must remember, Islam is not merely a system about spiritual matters. It is meant to encompass all aspects of life: political, cultural, family, and spiritual matters. Grimm and Finke say, social restrictions are higher within the Islamic tradition, not only because it looks to the community of Muslims and its religious leaders to regulate religion, but also because there are movements throughout the Muslim world that advocate a greater role for Islam in the public sphere, including implementing a stricter version of Sharia. By its own nature, Islam, in its purest form, cannot have a separation of church and state, like what Christianity fosters. This means that when disagreements happen in Islam, groups break off into different sects or schools of thought, which happens a lot. They won't merely bicker over spiritual matters, but political and cultural matters as well. And because Islam is necessarily political, their religious disputes will spill over into political disputes, which will lead to infighting for political power. As Toff says, Islam has had yet no equivalent to the separation of religion and state and the decline of Christian religious political authority, as seen in the West after the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia. The Islamic doctrine of Salafist jihad may make Muslims, whether locally or as transnational jihadists, more likely to fight in the name of Islam out of a sense of religious obligation. Elsewhere, Toff says, the process of religious outbidding would explain why Islam is so much more likely to be involved in religious civil wars than other religions. Islam has a specific, and today very active, obligation to defend by force component. Young men answer these calls by traveling to areas of conflict, often bringing cash and arms with them, to satisfy what they believed to be a religious obligation to defend Islam against attacks from non-believers. A lack of separation of church and state means there are religious motivations to advance Islam politically, and not just through evangelism. Davis Brown notes there is a scriptural basis for fighting as well. Surah 9 says, "Fight those who do not believe in Allah and the last day, nor comply with what Allah and His Messenger have forbidden, nor embrace the religion of truth from among those who were given the scripture, until they pay the tax, willingly submitting, fully humbled. The Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, while the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. Such are their baseless assertions, only parroting the words of earlier disbelievers. May Allah condemn them. How can they be deluded?" Islam's goal, according to its own texts, is perpetual war and conquest until all submit to the dominion of Islam. Brown says, "Many of God's revelations to Muhammad, which today constitute the Quran, coincided with military activity, and the victories and defeats associated with Islam's origins all contributed to how the Ummah defined itself. In addition, the early Muslims inherited a fatalistic determinism from their pre-Islamic Arab culture, with the resulting belief that all events were determined absolutely by God. Muslim jurists regarded jihad as the means to establish God's political supremacy, which was necessary to the supreme authority of God's word. Jihad was not merely the extension of the abode of Islam, but also the enforcement of the politico-religious authority. Early Muslim jurists repudiated perpetual treaties with non-Muslims, referring to passages in the Quran like, "Take not the Jews and the Christians for friends." For Muslims, the world is seen in two abodes, the house of Islam, and all others are in the house of war. Anything not under the dominance of Islam is considered to be at war with the house of Islam. Revival movements that invoke Dar al-Islam usually focus on a stricter application of Sharia, which in turn leads to more conflict and persecution. Muslim preachers even note more conflicts and the subjugation of non-Muslims will follow if Islam grows.
That is why when Muslims go and conquer the adjacent country, what do? We kill them all? No. The Prophet says, the first thing you do is call them to Islam. If they accept it, leave them. Khalas, they're Muslims. We go. We don't want your country. We don't want your land. We don't want your wealth. If they refuse, then tell them Allah obliged upon you to pay taxation, jizya. Stay kafir as you wish, no problem. But you have to give us a percentage and you enjoy sitting in your homes and in your country and live your life normally. But the ruling is for Sharia. So you do not open nightclubs, you do not fornicate in the streets, you do not, no, Sharia rules, but you live your life, you marry, you have children, you enjoy your life, but publicly, Islam rules. If they refuse, then we have to fight. And if we fight you, then we capture you, you become our slaves, and we take your land, and you take where, because you refuse, I give you two good options. This is the strength of Islam. But nowadays, forget this. Maybe in the coming 40, 50 years when the Muslims become strong as they're supposed to be, and they are focused and Islamically oriented.
Grimm and Finke find similar results in their book in terms of persecution. We propose that the battle between Muslims over the understanding and enactment of Sharia law is closely related to the religious restrictions and persecution that often follow. Although this may be in part a reaction against the centuries of Western domination, we find that this is primarily a struggle within Islam, rather than with the West. Islam's dominance means people of the book must be fully submissive, but that is interpreted differently between different groups in Islam. Discrimination and persecution follow when certain Muslims feel that minority groups living under their rule have not fully submitted or may be conspiring to rebel. The command to make Jews and Christians submit, that we are the worst of creatures and cannot even be friends with Muslims, can lead to a sense of superiority among many Muslims, and that the people of the book must be dominated, and that can manifest in horrible ways. Grimm and Finke say, "In our analysis of the cases, we find that persecution in Muslim-majority countries is less often associated with ethnic conflict and more often associated with such things as the vision that differing religious groups have for their society. The most lethal religion-related armed conflict in recent decades occurred during the Sudanese Civil War, which resulted in more than 6 million people being killed or displaced between 1989 and 2005. Religion played a central role in splitting the country into warring sides, primarily pitting government forces from the Muslim-majority north against an array of opposition forces from the south, which is largely Christian. The main dividing line was not ethnicity, but religion itself, as the North sought to make the country an Islamic republic, with Sharia as the law of the land." Adding to this terrifying reality, Joshua Wright found in his work that Muslims score higher in religious fundamentalism than Christians do. But fundamentalism leads to racial prejudice, hostility toward value-violating outgroups, and support for violence against outgroups. He said, "The evidence that Muslims tend to have more fundamental beliefs than other religious groups suggests that Muslims may be more susceptible to what Petchen Slade termed the terrorist meme, an ideal expressing selective interpretations of the Quran that is spread throughout the Islamic world. In this way, fundamentalist beliefs may act as a facilitator for religious terrorism." Similarly, describes how the jihadi message successfully motivates Muslims because it is a natural extension of the dominant narrative in the Islamic world and is minimally counterintuitive for most Muslims. Higher levels of fundamentalism may enhance the acceptance of the jihadi message. Brown and Choi note that several texts of the major schools of Sunni Islam support violence in multiple ways. The largest school is Hanafi. Its founder's original works are unavailable, but his disciple wrote extensively and has an entire chapter devoted to executing apostates of Islam. Brown and Choi note the word for martyr often appears in several authoritative texts of the Hanafi school, as well as in the Hanbali school and to a lesser extent the other two major schools. Although the word martyr appears nowhere in the translated texts of the Siyar, the word does appear extensively in the Sahihain, the Sahih Bukhari, and the Sahih Muslim, Bukhari offering a scriptural basis for radical Muslims' incentives to martyrdom. Also notes that the Sahih Bukhari offers the greatest support for the practice. These foundational and authoritative texts offer religious incentives to carry out violent attacks on apostates and non-Muslims. Of course, many Muslims claim terrorist attacks are not proper Islamic behavior. But the problem is there is no set agreement on how to properly interpret Islamic law. So these violent views arise naturally from Islamic thought, regardless of the fact that other Muslims disagree. Historian Raphael Israeli says, "There is no doubt that for Muslims, whose pursuit of jihad is an active and preponderant aspect of their lives, particularly so among the Palestinians, the question of reward in paradise constitutes a crucial portion of their worldview and plays a major role in their battle motivation." Another way Islam leads to conflict and violence is through a subject you might not expect, polygamy, or more specifically, polygyny. This is the practice of one man marrying multiple women, which Islam sanctions. Research has pointed out that this practice is extremely harmful to women and their offspring. But research has also found that polygyny is harmful to society, leads to more conflicts, violence, authoritarianism, and political instability. The reason as to why is not complicated. Humans have naturally produced a roughly even number of men and women, which means it makes sense to break off into pairs. But if the wealthiest men in any given society marry multiple women, there are fewer women for the other men. Let's say you have a small Muslim society of 100 men and 100 women. The top 10 men each marry 4 wives, which means they've just taken 40% of all the available women. Let's say the next 60 wealthiest men each decide to only marry 1 woman each. That would naturally leave 30 men, the bottom 30%, without wives. The truth is, for every man who has a second wife, he takes a wife from another man. Young unmarried men with no future or prospect of a family are the most likely to turn to violence and crime. Research has demonstrated that young unmarried men are the most likely category to resort to violence and even murder. In India, it was found that districts with higher ratios of unmarried men to women have higher rates of homicide. As Rose McDermott and Jonathan Cowden say, polygyny is concentrated everywhere in the wealthier families and leads to an accumulation of unmarried men in poorer classes. Polygyny therefore has the unfortunate consequences of generating a class of people, young unmarried men, who are statistically inclined to violence. Alan Miller and Satoshi Kanazawa state, across all societies, polygyny makes men more violent, increasing crimes such as murder and rape, even after controlling for such obvious factors as economic development, economic inequality, population density, the level of democracy, and political factors in the region. Research has continually found a significant correlation between polygyny and increased warfare, especially civil wars. Men tend to fight over women, especially when there are not enough to go around. And when several young, poor men are left without wives, they are more likely to join gangs or terrorist organizations to achieve power and status that they currently lack. This in turn leads to nations that allow polygyny to resort to more authoritarian measures to counteract terrorist groups and to preserve the power and status of the elites in society. McDermott and Cowden found startling results in their study. Examining over 170 countries around the world, we find that polygynous structures increase violence towards women and children, decrease civil rights and political liberties in the state more broadly, and increase the allocation of resources and society towards weapon procurement as well. Polygyny exerts economic, physical, and political consequences for societies in which such practices remain prevalent. Laura Betzig conducted an empirical study of roughly 186 societies. She found a tight correlation between polygyny and despotism. Another study found polygyny increases civil wars, but not interstate wars. Polygyny explains a greater proportion of the variance in civil war experience than democracy does in interstate war experience. If the democratic peace is the first law of international relations, then polygyny may be the first law of intergroup conflict. Hudson and DeBoer found that sex ratio imbalance, which is a natural result of polygyny, is associated with repressive and authoritarian regimes, as well as less even wealth distribution, whereas banning polygyny has been shown to increase savings by 70% and increase output per capita by 170%. Humans are a pair bonding species. We are meant to break off into pairs to create families. But when we deviate from this and practice polygamy, societies break down in multiple ways. Treating women like objects to be collected by rich and powerful men, and leaving a large population of young and poor men without wives, has dark ramifications. But remember, Islam sanctions polygyny, and can even be seen to encourage it, since Muhammad took multiple wives, and he is said to be an excellent moral example who Muslims should imitate. These Islamic teachings directly lead to less optimal societies and increased violence. As Miller and Kanazawa note, it is the combination of polygyny and the promise of a large harem of virgins in heaven that motivate many young Muslim men to commit suicide bombings. Consistent with this explanation, all studies of suicide bombers indicate that they are significantly younger than not only the Muslim population in general, but other non-suicidal members of their own extreme political organizations, like Hamas and Hezbollah, and nearly all suicide bombers are single. Islam's propensity towards violence, conflict, discrimination, and authoritarianism is nothing new. This is how Islam began and is manifested throughout history. Let's remember that Muhammad was a warlord. He personally participated in 27 campaigns and directed another 59 during the last 9 years of his life. He even used the spoils of raids to lure people to Islam by playing on their greed. Robert Hoyland says, Muhammad initially attempted to spread his message solely by preaching, but he received a hostile reception from most of his fellow Meccans and had to make a journey in search of refuge, ending up in the nearby oasis town of Medina. The time of peaceful preaching was over now. He decided, and it was time to use force to carry out what he perceived to be God's will. To cover some examples, Ibn Ishaq tells us of a man named Abu Afaq, an elderly man, who wrote a poem criticizing people for becoming Muslims. Muhammad demanded that he be killed, and so the old man was murdered in his sleep. Then a woman named Asma heard what the Muslims had done, and so she wrote a poem calling for people to stand against Islam. Muhammad ordered that she be killed as well. When the murderer reported back to Muhammad, he said, "Two goats won't butt their heads about her." The Jews of Qurayza resisted Muhammad's authority. Muhammad's army surrounded them and besieged them for 25 nights. After they achieved victory, we read then the apostle went out to the market of Medina, which is still its market today, and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for them and struck off their heads in those trenches, as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. Every boy who had reached puberty was killed. Muhammad divided the women, children, and property among his soldiers, taking a fifth of the spoils for himself. As Muhammad continued his conquest, he allowed his men to take the wives of those they defeated in battle as sex slaves. We even see sleeping with sex slaves as sanctioned in the Quran. According to Sahih Muslim, he planned to forcibly expel all the Jews and Christians from Arabia, and it was completed shortly after his death. After he finally died, his companions carried out one of the largest campaigns of conquest and violence the world has ever seen. Many civilians were killed, tortured, or enslaved. When they came to Cyprus, Hoyland says, "The Arabs roamed freely across the mountains and the plains, hunting for plunder and slaves. They winkled the natives out of the cracks in the ground, like eggs abandoned in the nest. The Arabs ravaged all the lands of Armenia, Albania, and Sunik, and stripped all the churches. They seized as hostages the leading princes of the country and the wives, sons, and daughters of many people." One monk recorded, "Their robber bands went to distant parts into the islands, bringing back captives from all the peoples under the heavens." From the Hindu Kush, they demanded an annual tribute of apparently 1,000 of their most beautiful boys, each one holding in his hands a golden cup, a delicious taste for Muslims of the delights of paradise. When slave revolts occurred, the Muslim conquerors complained, "Our slaves are rebelling against us," complained the Kufan notables, "yet they are our booty, which God has granted us together with these lands." The Islamic slave trade continued to operate from the 7th century until the 20th century, when it was shut down due to Western pressure. Over 11 million Africans were kidnapped and taken to Islamic lands. The Muslim armies worked their way across North Africa, into Spain, present-day Turkey, and through Central Asia. They attacked places like Sicily, Rome, France, and Greece, leaving thousands dead, taking many back as slaves, and ransacking and destroying hundreds of churches. Tom Holland says, "These captives were not only to be found in the streets, they were in the conqueror's bedrooms too. The right to sleep with such slaves as God has assigned to you as war booty was one that Muslims could enjoy on the say-so of the Prophet himself. Plenty of them had capitalized upon it with relish. The slave markets were so glutted with female flesh that wealthy Arabs debated the various merits of the merchandise as though evaluating the pedigree of bloodstock." Persecution of Jews and Christians occurred under several Muslim rulers, like Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, the Almohads, the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Ottomans. Moses Maimonides, a Jewish scholar, wrote, "God has entangled us with this people, the nation of Ishmael, who treat us so prejudicially, and who legislate our harm and hatred. No nation has ever arisen more harmful than they, nor has anyone done more to humiliate us, degrade us, and consolidate hatred against us." The Ottomans instituted a policy called the Devshirme. Soldiers raided through the Balkans and took Christian boys, forcibly converted them to Islam, brainwashed them, turning them into slave soldiers for the Ottomans. It is estimated that while this policy was in place, somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were kidnapped and enslaved by the Ottomans. There are dozens upon dozens of examples I could cover. Islam's origins and history matches what we find in the sociological research. It is a religion replete with conquest, enslavement, terror, and crimes against humanity. And it is a religion determined to continue war until the end. One hadith has Muhammad stating, "The hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and a stone behind them which a Jew will be hiding will say, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, so kill him.'" Islam is a religion that will bring chaos and destruction the more it spreads, and this is because of what Islam inherently teaches. Davis Brown says, Islamic law is frozen at a time when Islamdom was very strong and successful, its technology equivalent or superior to that of its rivals, its higher learning flourishing, its military campaigns largely successful, and Islam itself being propagated rapidly. These characteristics naturally induced a historical perception of self-superiority, and that perception has strongly influenced the Islamic perception of otherness. In Islam, the other consists of the forces of deception, unbelief, and shirk, as opposed to the forces of the straight path and submission to God. Such a worldview is a recipe for Islamic hostility towards non-Islam. Now, it is true that other civilizations have engaged in genocide, slavery, and crimes against humanity. The West, for example, has its problems and history of crimes. But the sociological research supports the notion that this was not as tied to religion, like what we see with Islamic culture. Christianity has not created the same negative effects that come out of Islam, and has generated a ton of moral progress. The truth is, if you are promoting and spreading Islam, you are making the world a worse place. Because there is no denying that the more Islam spreads, the worse things will be for humanity. Perhaps we should hope this one hadith turns out to be true. Verily, Islam started as something strange, and it would again revert to its old position of being strange, just as it started, and it would recede between two mosques, just as a serpent crawls back into its hole. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.